Previously in Chapter 5 of My Name Is Sheba. Colette, now on hold, TV on in the background, sat with a vacant stare. Occasionally, she'd check on Sheba, who was sleeping peacefully, oblivious to the event that had just rocked their world, and then grab the remote, toggling between news channels for updates. She noticed that CNN was now reporting the crash as breaking news. She turned again and looked at Sheba. Colette couldn't look at her baby without thinking of her mom. Jewel had become inextricably connected to them in this season of life. They were a unit, and Jewel was their sole supporter. By 6:45 p.m., the first survivor had been identified. The corresponding family member was notified and given the name of the hospital where they could find their loved one. Over the next 3.5 hours, 14 survivors would be identified. It felt like the lottery to Burg. Every 15 minutes or so, a name was called. A friend or family member looked up in hope and rushed to the check-in counter. During the interim, he'd learned by gaining access to the manifest that Jewel had indeed been on the flight. The aircraft was a Boeing 737 carrying 131 passengers. By 11 o'clock, it'd been almost 45 minutes since the last name had been called. Burg began to get a sick feeling in the pit of his stomach. He checked in with Colette, being as vague as possible, hoping she'd not heard anything ahead of him. Then he started calling the hospitals in the area. Mount Sinai, Queens, no word. Elmhurst, no. Flushing, nothing. No Jewel Blue anywhere. Weary and discouraged, Burg missed his family. He wanted to go home. As he sat expressionless on the subway, scenes from the last 4 months played in his mind like ancient home movies from a lifetime ago. He shook his head, looked down, and tried hard not to think. During the night, Sheba slept, the blue light of the TV flickered, and Burg and Colette held on tight to each other, never dozing for more than 15 minutes at a time. At 6 a.m., the call they feared came in. They were formally notified by the airline that Jewel had been lost. From Subplay Creative, I'm Monroe Jones, and this is My Name Is Sheba, the coming-of-age saga of iconic jazz R&B artist Sheba Hawkins' rise from obscurity as an orphan to superstardom and the music she created along the way. A different kind of story about the creative life and the beautiful struggle. My Name Is Sheba is written around the original music from the album of the same name by singer-songwriter Kandace Springs. You can find My Name Is Sheba, the album, and the podcast at Spotify, Apple Music, or wherever you listen. Chapter 6. Wednesday morning at 8:45 a.m., there was a knock on the door. With Sheba not sleeping and Burg and Colette tag-teaming through the night, they'd not fallen asleep till 7:30. Burg, startled, opened the door in a daze. "Hello, my name is Laura Stewart with the New York Child Protective Services." It had not been a good week. On Tuesday, the power had been shut off, and running low on funds, they'd skipped the last couple of meals to make sure Sheba had what she needed. The apartment was bordering on hot and in disarray, and with no air conditioning, there was now an odor that reeked of neglect, not to mention the appearance of Burg and Colette having been startled out of a deep sleep. Caught by surprise, and in their minds having nothing to hide, they allowed the woman in. They were unprepared for the questions that followed. Rapid fire from the CPS rep who sat before them, crisply dressed with perfect posture. And then, as if on cue, Sheba started crying. Burg and Cole were transparent about their situation. They explained the details and recent events clearly and specifically in a heartfelt manner that conveyed their honesty. When they finished, the rep sat silently for what seemed an excruciatingly long period of time, sternly looking both of them in the eye. She then looked around, surveying the apartment. "You know, you're bordering on neglect." She reached into a leather portfolio briefcase and pulled out a form. "Here are the necessary changes you'll need to make to retain custody of your child. Since this is our first visit, and there are no prior incidents, if you complete the form and satisfy the specified requirements by our next scheduled visit, we can clear your record and drop the case. But the air must be turned back on by the end of the day today. I must warn you both, this is serious. We received a call that expressed concern over your ability to fitfully care for your child. Here's my card. I've been assigned as your caseworker. If you have any questions, our number and my extension is on the back. Please call when the power's back on. If they can't get the power going today, you'll need to make some other arrangements to keep cool. But regardless, we need to have these requirements met by no later than Monday. What day works for you next week?" Miss Stewart stood up, walked over to the door, and let herself out. Burg and Colette sat in silence. Burg looking over at Sheba, and Cole with her hand over her mouth looking at Burg. The false narrative fully embraced them now. They did not deserve Sheba. Nor did Sheba deserve to be in these circumstances. They'd both become convinced that giving her up for adoption was the right thing to do. Their hearts were breaking, but this gesture was for Sheba, not them. The next morning, they called Miss Stewart and discussed the possibility of putting their child up for adoption. After a long conversation about the logistics and making sure that Burg and Colette had considered and understood the gravity of their decision, Miss Stewart agreed to put them in touch with an adoption agency. They'd not understood. They only knew what had to be done in this moment to protect their child from themselves and to ensure her future. If they'd not compartmentalized their emotions, the pain would have been too great to bear. "Oh yes, we're affiliated with a great children's home in Brooklyn," said Miss Stewart. "The Branford Home for Children is a warm, caring environment that has a great track record for placing children in loving, stable homes. In most cases, they find suitable homes within 6 months of a child's arrival. There's a waiting list of eligible families that have already been vetted and approved. For the adoptive parents, it's quite an extensive process. They must complete a program that includes months of education, counsel, and background checks to qualify. You can even specify the type of family environment you'd like your child to be in, and they'll take those requests into consideration when finding a suitable home. Would you like to tour the facility?" Burg and Colette had already made up their minds, and their resolve had only strengthened after Miss Stewart's glowing pitch for the children's home made them feel wholly inadequate. They'd decided to give Sheba up for adoption, provided the facility met their expectations. They felt a sense of urgency now, and they wanted to commit this act together, sharing the pain, history, responsibility, and above all, the guilt. Not because it's a crime placing a baby up for adoption, but because there might have been the slightest possibility the two could have made this work out and didn't fight for it. Truth be told, there was no fight left. They were defeated, but the voice in their head whispering, "You didn't fight for Sheba," was a notion they would silently wrestle with for years to come. The last night with Sheba was emotional to say the least. They'd completed the paperwork and any formalities. Now all that remained was to pack up her few special belongings. Then Burg and Colette wrote a letter to their daughter, explaining as best they could their hopeless situation and undying love for their beautiful girl. For Colette, the irony was overwhelming. There's our daughter. She's right there. She's with us. And yet, here we are, writing this letter, she thought. No, she'll have a better shot now. she told herself. They placed the letter in a sealed envelope to be given to the birth parents in hopes that one day they'd allow Sheba to read it. The next morning, as they made their way to the facility, the sky was deep blue, and the sun shone with the light of late summer. The temperature was warm, but with an early hint that fall was coming. Burg and Colette carried the weight of their world, and Sheba was oblivious. When they arrived, they paused and stood outside as they took in the appearance of the Branford Home for Children. The house was an early 20th century Victorian located in the Flatbush neighborhood of Brooklyn. As they walked up the sidewalk, Miss Stewart, smiling and impeccably dressed, came out to greet them. "You made it. Let's go in." As they climbed the stairs, walked across the large, wide-planked porch to the front door, then inside, they felt as though they'd been transported to another era. The foyer was grand and ornate, with a high ceiling. Every sound they made reverberated throughout the first floor. Burg and Colette stepped lightly, trying not to call attention to themselves. As they waited for the director, they could hear the sound of busy little voices emanating from various corners of the large home. From one area, singing. From another, reciting of some sort. And from another, playful chatter. Burg exhaled, cautiously allowing himself to be comforted.
"Hello, I'm Amanda Trinsdale, the director here at Branford."
The director appeared to be in her early 70s. Her appearance, more black and white than color, was what one might expect walking into an old Victorian house, but it was hard to picture her on the subway or walking the streets of modern-day Brooklyn. Her attire looked more like a costume from the suffragette movement.
"Let's step into my office for a few minutes and get acquainted,"
she said. Her office was rich with darkly stained wood grain trim, tall bookshelves, and a vaulted beadboard ceiling. A large, tarnished brass fixture from the 30s hung overhead. The faded oriental rug and old framed photos and portraits hanging on the walls and scattered about on every available space completed the effect. This was a house full of stories and personal history. Only the phone and computer on Miss Trinsdale's desk betrayed the current decade.
"Amy, can you bring us some tea, please?"
"Yes, Miss Trinsdale."
"This house was one of 8 properties the Branfords owned around the country,"
she said.
"It was the first Victorian built on this street. They would live here when Archie Sr. had business in New York. In those days, Brooklyn was basically farmland. The Trinsdales and the Branfords were very close. I used to play in this house as a little girl. My father founded the Children's Home when Archie bought a brownstone on the Upper East Side and donated this house in 1936. I worked here as a teenager, and it became my life's work after I graduated from Barnard College."
2 soft taps on the door, and Amy entered with a tea cart carrying water, coffee, tea, and cookies.
"We would love for you to tour the home, meet the staff, and stay for lunch if you're able,"
said Miss Trinsdale. Burg and Colette looked at each other and nodded. "We'd like that very much," said Colette. After the history lesson, Miss Trinsdale stood to escort them out and tour the campus. At this point, sensing that time was running out, Colette reached down, lifted Sheba out of the carrier, and held her close as they walked the grounds, hoping that, somehow, the experience of this last moment together would pervade Sheba's heart and psyche, sending the secret message, "We're your family. We love you and want to be together. Please forgive us. Please come find us when you're able." Burg, Colette, Miss Stewart, and Miss Trinsdale strolled the grounds, observing the various classes.
"We take in children of all ages and provide an excellent education while they're here,"
said Miss Trinsdale. As they walked past the music room, Burg and Colette noticed the various instruments and the concert grand piano. They kept moving, giving no impression that the music room meant more than any other class they'd seen. There was a large backyard filled with children playing. In every area, they met and chatted with the staff. caretakers, the psychologists, social workers, all of whom had stories of children who'd come through the home, been adopted, and gone on to happy, well-adjusted lives out in the world.
We've had many children come back and visit as adults, just to say thank you. It's very gratifying,
said Miss Trinsdale. The last stop on the list before lunch was the nursery. It was not as Burg and Colette had imagined. They'd grown up seeing orphanages and movies depicted as drab or cold, white, sterile environments. The space at Branford was large, warm, and colorful, appearing to be well-staffed. As they spoke with the caregivers, Burg and Colette found that they all had professional backgrounds as registered nurses, coming from notable hospitals and practices. The whole environment felt safe and reassuring, a feeling they'd not had in a long, long time. As the group made their way to the lunchroom, they found themselves in a large, more modern space with a piano against the wall and a stage at one end. Doubling as an auditorium, the lunchroom, built in the early 70s, was an addition to the existing structure. They grabbed trays, Burg taking one for both he and Colette, and funneled through the kitchen, cafeteria style, greeting the food service staff as they went. The food was hot and not unbearable. The adults sat at a large table and talked, while children of various ages in an orderly fashion filed in and out, sitting at tables around them, arranged in rows throughout the room. Burg and Colette took note of their demeanor. The kids seemed happy, social, and well-behaved. Colette turned and noticed a boy who looked to be around 6 years old sitting at the next table. He looked up and saw her at the same moment.
You're pretty,
he said. Why, thank you, said Colette.
You've got red hair like me,
he said. I sure do. What's your name?
Robert, but everybody calls me Rusty.
Hi, Rusty. I'm Cole, and this is Burg.
Those are funny names. Who's that?
He said, pointing to Sheba. This is Sheba.
She's very little,
said the boy. Yes, she is, said Colette, her emotions suddenly running away with her. She could feel the tears coming. Swallowing, she quickly said, It's nice to meet you, Rusty, and turned back around. But Colette knew that he was still looking at her. The little boy sensed her sadness, but didn't know why. He felt sad for her, and wondered if maybe they could use a little boy in their family. After lunch, they reconvened in the director's office to discuss procedure and go over any other questions Burg and Colette might have. They also looked through some case files of parents wishing to adopt, all of whom appearing to Burg to be more suitable than he had been. By mid to late afternoon, there was a lull, and a sense by everyone in the room that all knowable details had been covered. The soft, metronome-like ticking of the clock on the mantel made the office feel tranquil. Yet Burg and Colette felt a sudden shot of adrenaline as they realized they'd reached the moment of truth. Miss Trinsdale, now taking on the manner of a wise, loving matriarch, looked them both in the eye and asked,
Mr. and Miss Hawkins, in light of your experience here today, have you made your decision as to how we can best help you care for your daughter?
The question was articulated sensitively but deliberately in a way that made it very clear whose agonizing decision this was to make. Burg and Colette looked at each other, not knowing how to get the words out. Then Burg, wanting to spare Colette from living with the memory of having said the words, jumped. In a soft, quavery voice, he said, We'd like you to find a home for our daughter. He looked again at Cole, who faintly nodded. They both looked back at the director with a helpless expression that begged the question, how do we do this? Miss Trinsdale knew straight away and walked them through the process.
You can hand your baby over to me if you like, or I can call a nurse if you'd prefer that, or we can walk to the nursery.
Miss Stewart, expressionless, stood by as a witness. Burg and Colette, longing for one last moment with Sheba, turned with her back to the others in the room. And quietly, tears flowing, Burg hugged both of them. They both kissed their daughter. Then Colette, not being able to hand her baby off to anyone, stooped down, placed a sleeping Sheba in the carrier, tucked the handwritten letter into the pocket on the side, and gently placed the carrier on top of the director's desk. Kissing Sheba on the forehead one last time and mouthing a tearful "thank you" to the director, Burg and Colette walked out, down the steps, down the sidewalk to the street, and made it to the corner before falling apart. Over the next couple of weeks, Burg and Colette found themselves to be quiet and introspective, staying close by, but giving each other the space to work through all they'd experienced in their own way. It would be a lifelong process. Time now would forever be marked as before Sheba and after Sheba. Colette's therapy was to immerse herself in her lyric writing, while Burg had become more prolific than ever, subconsciously allowing the pain to produce haunting melodies on a level far above anything he'd ever written before. Their music took on a melancholy, reflective quality. The remaining empty spaces were filled with busyness now. Colette had taken a part-time job at a coffee shop around the corner, and Burg was playing in a hotel lobby on the Upper East Side. They'd performed together a couple of times in a small venue with positive response, but had not played at Dizzy's since before Sheba was born. One Thursday afternoon, Burg came home to a message from Des, the manager.
"Hey, you guys, Des here. Where y'all at? We're missing our star duo up here. Got a slot that opened up for Saturday night if you want to fill it. Give me a shout."
They discussed the offer when Colette got in from the coffee shop. "Do you think we're ready?" said Colette, her face softening with the slightest hint of a grin for the first time in weeks. Burg smiled back. "I think this would be good for us." Their smiles were filtered through sadness now, but no less a sign that all hope was not lost. They called Des. That Saturday night, Dizzy's was sold out. Des, seizing the opportunity to fill the club, had spent the last 48 hours getting the word out and hyping the show as Burgundy and Blues' homecoming. The Blitz worked. That night, when Burg and Colette appeared before the packed house, they were noticeably different. At first glance, one might have assumed they were just more seasoned, coming into their own as artists. But in reality, they'd been fully transformed by their experience. They were no longer creating catchy little numbers they hoped their audience would like. They were now revealing their heart, opening their diary, and blanketing the audience with a musical intimacy that would leave them spellbound. The listeners would now experience a phenomenon not necessarily new, but rare. As Leo Tolstoy so famously said, art is not a handicraft. It is the transmission of feeling the artist has experienced. After opening with the tunes their audience had come for, they transitioned into something that was hard to convey for someone who'd not been there. Launching into the product of their sorrow, they were now telling a sad, beautiful story. Not literally, but one that resonated with anyone who'd experienced life. The new music engaged the beholder on an emotional level which made it impossible to listen passively. Reconfiguring the set list, Burg had moved Rain Falling up in the sequence and had now chosen to introduce one of the newer songs as the closer. This would become somewhat of a tradition when they occasionally played smaller venues in later years. This night for them had been real medicine, and they were grateful. Without playful banter or lengthy setup, Burg looked out, overcome with emotion, and simply said, "Thank you guys for sharing the night with us. You know we love you so much." With that, they closed with a new tune they'd written called Atmosphere. The wilderness can be so lonesome. Burg and Colette had unwittingly found their voice. They were on their way. But at what cost?
The wilderness can be so lonesome. My inner being seeks what makes me whole. Clouds shade my heart from the sun. Stillness to my soul. Only such true love seeking you will find. Somehow found in love, but only left Life is a long journey. New changes always unfold. Life is an endless story. I was once only such true love seeking you will find. Somehow found love, but left
Coming up in Chapter 7 of My Name Is Sheba.
So I'd like to hear more about the orphanage. Can you share some of your earliest memories there? What are the standouts?
asked Carter Baird. Sheba sat quietly, contemplating her answer.
I think my earliest memory is from when I was around. I can see it, but I'm not sure exactly when it was. I remember I lived in a large, old, musty house with lots of kids. The rooms echoed when we talked. Except for where we slept, there were many beds and lots of blankets in that room because it got really cold in the winter. I think I daydreamed a lot, and sometimes I wouldn't hear the teachers because I was looking out a window wishing I was far away. There were 3.
This chapter of My Name Is Sheba was written, recorded, and produced by me, Monroe Jones. The song Atmosphere was written and performed by Kandace Springs and can be heard on her new album, also entitled My Name Is Sheba, and can be found at Spotify, Apple, or wherever you stream music. Other original music in this episode is by Jason Donnelly, Bobby Cole, Humans Win, and Ray Ailey, all of whom have royalty-free music available at Storyblocks. That's storyblocks.com. For more behind-the-scenes info on the creators of the story and the music, visit mynameissheba.com. Finally, if you like what you're hearing, please follow, leave a rating, and tell a friend. My Name is Sheba is a product of Subplay Creative.